Foreign Affairs editor Kethevane Gorjestani is joining me here on set. Kethevane, what more do we know then about the details of this tentative, anyway, Black Sea deal?
Well, that the main focus is just that, which is to stop the fighting in the Black Sea and to allow for the safe navigation throughout that sea. Of course, the Black Sea has been critical since the start of the war, basically. There was a first attempted deal, the Black Sea Initiative, that lasted about a year before the Russians pulled out. And it's interesting because unlike on the front line, on the battlefield, where Russia clearly has the momentum and the dominance, in the Black Sea, it's very different because that's where the Ukrainians sort of are going head-to-head with the Russians, and there's no real disadvantage for the Ukrainians there. The Black Sea is the focus, but there were also talks going further a little bit, going into the details of this possible ceasefire when it comes to striking energy infrastructure, with the Kremlin apparently presenting sort of a list of the sort of facilities that it considers being infrastructure, because they are still trying to work out how that ceasefire on energy infrastructure would work. So as you see in both cases, we're not just there yet. There is a sort of broader agreement, but no real details. That doesn't prevent the Americans from being extremely positive about this tentative deal. The Russians and the Ukrainians on this one pretty much in agreement by being much less optimistic. The Ukrainians saying we have no faith in the Russians, and the Russians saying we have sad experiences in the past with agreements with Ukraine. So it gives you an idea of where they both stand. And when it comes to the Black Sea potential deal, we don't have information on how it will be monitored, who is going to decide what ship is military, what ship is commercial. We don't have information on what would constitute exact violation of that ceasefire, and we don't even know when it's going to start. The Ukrainians seem to be under the impression that because there was an agreement, it would start right now. The Russians say, hold on, we agree to it in principle, but we have very specific conditions to implement that ceasefire.
Yeah, Russia seemingly agreeing to the deal, but as you say, adding a lot of conditions. What are they?
Well, the main conditions is that they want to see some of the Western sanctions lifted, mainly sanctions on Russian agriculture, fertilizer exports, and that goes along with lifting some of the sanctions on a certain specific Russian banks that deal with those agricultural products, and even further than that, sort of lifting some of the sanctions that prevent Russian banks from operating in the international financial market. This strategy of asking for more, of getting more concessions, is what we've seen all along with the Russians, starting with the first initial attempt at a ceasefire. Remember, back then, the U.S. told the Ukrainians, this is the deal we want, immediate 30-day full ceasefire. The Ukrainians said yes. The Russians said yes, but we have conditions. And this is what you're seeing. Every time the Russians say yes, but, yes, but. And this is something that is allowing the Russians to sort of play the clock because, as I was saying earlier, they have the momentum on the ground. And every day that there is no ceasefire is a day where the Russians technically can grab more ground, can grab more momentum. And this is something that Donald Trump has actually, for the first time, publicly acknowledged. In an interview yesterday, he said the Russians, could be dragging their feet, even though he said that he believes that the Russians, in the end, want a ceasefire. But so far, unlike with the Ukrainians, where the Americans said, if you don't agree with what we're proposing, we're going to suspend the weapons, we're going to suspend intelligence. With the Russians, so far, they're giving them the benefit of the doubt. They're not putting that pressure on the Russians to agree to what the Americans are proposing. How long that will last, this goodwill from the United States, is to be seen.
Yeah, let's think ahead to the next few days and the attention, if you like, coming a little bit back towards Europe. Of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, as we said, right at the top, arriving in Paris later for talks. There's this huge summit tomorrow. Where do they fit into this process, or don't they?
Well, right now in this process, they have absolutely no place, because this is happening between the Americans and the Ukrainians on one hand, and the Americans and the Russians on the other hand. The problem with that is that the Europeans will have to be involved in any of this process. The Americans, for example, are indicating that they are willing to maybe push for some of those Western sanctions to be lifted. If they don't get the agreement of the Europeans, they can lift their own sanctions, but that is just part of the problem for the Russians. And right now, the Europeans are saying, we're not halting sending weapons to the Ukrainians. This is going to be part of the discussion tomorrow. And they are not really considering lifting any sanctions. That's not where they are at right now. What they want is to continue to strengthen Ukraine, and to continue to strengthen Ukraine in order for Ukraine to be in a better spot to negotiate peace. And lifting the sanctions, which is the biggest leverage they have over the Russians, is not really on their mind right now. A French official was briefing reporters yesterday, and he said that the sanctions were necessary instruments of pressure on Russia. The problem for the Russians is that, for example, the international financial market that I was talking about, SWIFT is a big part of that, and it's based in Belgium, and it was the Europeans who banned most of Russian banks from operating on SWIFT. So they would have to green light lifting that ban. And right now, this is not really on the table. What the Europeans are focusing on is defense, security, and sovereignty of Ukraine. They're pushing ahead with what they see. They're pushing ahead with this idea of the coalition of the willing. How do we secure Ukraine? Because they clearly don't trust the Russians the way the Americans do. The problem is you have these two sort of operating lines in negotiations that don't seem to be connecting. The only connection right now that you see is the Ukrainians, Volodymyr Zelensky and his team, talking to the Americans and talking to the Europeans. But we'll see what comes out of the meeting this evening with the French president and this big meeting of the coalition of the willing tomorrow.
Yeah, lots more coverage, of course, of that to come over the next 24 hours or so here on France 24. Kethevane, thanks very much. International Affairs Editor Kethevane Gorjestani there.